I'm going to talk to you about pangolins. What are they? Where are they? And the what refers very much to what the animals actually are, and the where refers to where are they in conservation terms. So I'm just going to start. Alison's already mentioned some of this, but I did my PhD at the University of Kent in 2014, looking at reforming international wildlife trade interventions in CITES, which included a focus on pangolins, principally in Asia, but I also touched on issues in Africa as well. And I'll say more about that in my talk. I then worked for IUCN for 4 years, where I led the CITES focus work, taking knowledge from the IUCN and the Species Survival Commission and commissions such as that into CITES and other MEA spaces. And then since 2018, I've been at Oxford, and I broadly do research under 2 research streams, one on pangolins and then a second on wildlife trade policy, which is typically anything I can anything that interests me and I want to go and research, including contentious issues like trophy hunting. So what am I going to do this evening? Well, I'm going to introduce you to pangolins, and then going to talk about their valuation by people through time, touch on trade and trafficking in the species. That obviously links to their threats, and then talk about their status and what is pangolin conservation today. I'm then going to outline some key challenges facing pangolins and what needs to happen if we're going to conserve them. And then I'm going to finish up with a couple of slides introducing a project that I'm working on at the moment called Operation Pangolin, in which we hope to try and overcome some of these challenges. And then there should be plenty of time at the end for some questions and answers and maybe some discussion. So what is a pangolin? Well, this is a pangolin, or more specifically, this is a Temminck's ground pangolin in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. Smutsia temminckii, that's a scientific name. And the most obvious thing about it is that it's covered in these overlapping scales made of keratin, which cover all the major surfaces of the body, including the dorsum and the ventral and dorsal surfaces of the tail and the outside of the limbs. It's the face and the ventral surface. They're the only parts of the body that don't really have scales. The scales are not like elephant tusks, which are teeth, or rhino horns. They're actually homologous with primate nails. So an unkind way of thinking about pangolins is that they're mammals covered in fingernails, which is not so appealing, I don't think. So there are 8 species. On the left here are the African species, the white-bellied pangolin, the giant, the black-bellied in the ground, or Temminck's pangolin. And 3 of those species are distributed in West and Central Africa, and then the Temminck's pangolin is distributed primarily in East and Southern Africa. And then in Asia, there are 4 species too, the Chinese, the Philippine, the Sunda, and the Indian, and again, widely distributed collectively from Pakistan at the western expanse of their range, throughout India and Sri Lanka, and then southern China and mainland and island Southeast Asia, including the Palawan faunal region in the Philippines, where the Philippine pangolin is found. And this is a nice picture of a black-bellied pangolin, and I've put it up just to show you the difference between some of the species, and I'll say more about this in a second, but this is obviously very different to the Temminck's pangolin that I just showed you. It's got different skin color, its scales are a different size, a different shape, a different color, etc. So all pangolins share a basic morphology, but there are lots of differences between the species, some of which are more subtle than others. So size and weight is perhaps the most obvious one. The black-bellied pangolin that I showed you, like the white-bellied pangolin, sort of if you held them in your hand, which you could, they'd weigh sort of 1.5 to 2 kilos. The giant pangolin gets up to around 40 kilos, so very big. In fact, the biggest pangolin recorded today is a 48-kilogram Indian pangolin, or pangzilla, as we've named it. They also differ in terms of the scale disposition and the size. Obviously, giant pangolins have much bigger scales than others, and it varies in terms of the size of the scales and whereabouts on the body you find them. The scales also differ in color. So the Indian pangolin picture there shows these scales as a dusky brown color, whereas the black-bellied, really quite an attractive species with these very dark or black scales that are then fringed at the end there with some yellow or ivory coloring. The tail length differs enormously. The Chinese pangolin has a really short tail compared to, say, the black-bellied pangolin, also called the long-tailed pangolin, actually holds the record within mammals for the number of vertebrae that it has, 47. Some of the species have tail pads as well, which helps them because they have prehensile tails, and that helps them climb trees and attach themselves to other structures. And some of the species also have more prominent ear pinnae than others. The Chinese pangolin in particular looks like it has a proper set of ears. You don't find that in the African species. And another difference between the African and Asian species is the Asian species have bristles or hairs between the scales. You don't find that in the African species either. And all species of pangolin have no teeth. And if you're interested in which is the most scaly pangolin, it turns out it's the Philippine pangolin. We were interested in this a few years ago, so we did some research, and that's a chart on the right that shows that there. They have a whole range of anatomical adaptations to their ecosystem role, and there's just some of the some that I've included on this slide here. So they have an elongated ziphisternum, which you can see here on the top image at the right-hand side. We have one of these, but it's very elongated in pangolins, and it houses the structure that houses the tongue. And it actually goes all the way back into the abdominal cavity and then it actually turns dorsally towards the spine. So they've got really long tongues and they're housed in a really large part of their body. They also have enlarged salivary glands, which means they have a really long and sticky tongue. If you ever encounter pangolin saliva, try washing your hands, and then you'll need to wash your hands again and probably again because it's really, really incredibly sticky. And then they have these cornified denticles in the stomach. I don't know if you can see that part of the stomach where the TO is pointing, but that's the part of the stomach where there's these cornified denticles, which are made of keratin, and they help grind up the pangolin's prey, which is ants and termites. In terms of their evolution and taxonomy, well, both of these are really fascinating for pangolins. There's different clocks that have been used to assess the evolution of pangolins, but common understanding is that they evolved around 70 to 80 million years ago. The earliest fossil pangolins are from the late to middle Eocene, around 45 million years ago. I think those are from the Messel pits in Germany. And you can see here on the bottom of the slide a late Eocene paleoanodont, which is one of the ancestors of pangolins. Taxonomically, they've been classed with elephants, with manatees, with sloths, with aardvarks, of course. And going back to Linnaeus, he put them in the order Bruta with elephants. And it was Weber in 1904 who gave them ordinal status. And this is the most commonly recognized taxonomic place of pangolins today. So they exist in their own order, Pholidota, their own family, Manidae, and then in at least 3 genera. So the African terrestrial species are in Smutsia, like the Temminck's pangolin that I showed you. The arboreal or semi-arboreal African pangolins are in Fata genus, and the Asian species are in Manis. And it's worth highlighting here that several new species of pangolin have been proposed. So there's some cryptic diversity out there that we've yet to understand. We can debate the merits of what that means for conservation actions that need to be taken for pangolins, but it's likely that in coming years we will find new pangolin species and they'll be formally recognized. Okay, so on to something about their habitat and ecology. Well, they occur in a wide range of habitats. Coniferous, bamboo, dipterocarp forests, including gardens and plantations, assuming they're not unduly persecuted. You find them in urban areas where they're not persecuted, so parts of Taiwan, for instance, Singapore, Hong Kong. They're also found in savanna grasslands and riverine and gallery and swamp forests. And you can see some of the habitats in the photos here. So this is an Indian pangolin on the Potahol Plateau in Pakistan at the top there. The middle photo is a black-bellied pangolin in the swamp forests of Cote d'Ivoire. And then the Temminck's pangolin at the bottom, that red sand, is the Kalahari in South Africa. They're solitary creatures, and they lead either arboreal, semi-arboreal, or fossorial lifestyles. And when it comes to them being fossorial, it gets really interesting because the giant pangolins, we don't know too much about those in comparison to some other species, but they have really big burrows. They can go 4 meters deep and 30 meters long. And I'm an adult male, and I would be able to climb down some of those burrows. I haven't done it yet, but I mean to. So really impressive. And they're also principally nocturnal species, apart from the black-bellied pangolin, Fata genus Tetradactyla. That's diurnal as far as we know. So they are myrmecophagous. They predate on ants and termites, but they're prey selective. So they select the different species of ants and termites that they prey upon. And that changes seasonally in some species based on what we know to date. And they therefore play a really important role in regulating social insect populations. We don't really know how many prey items they consume, but estimates that are out there suggest it's at least millions a year. I just touched on their burrows, and so they're a form of ecosystem engineer because their burrows end in these large resting chambers where pangolins rest, but they also provide shelter for a range of different species, so small rodents, pythons, bats, mongoose, and others. And perhaps rather endearingly, their defense mechanism is to simply roll up into a ball. And they have a range of predators. This is a mugger crocodile here at the bottom, predating on an Indian pangolin in Sri Lanka. This is a male African lion with a Temminck's pangolin in its mouth. And this is a Sumatran tiger with a Sunda pangolin in its mouth. But it's interesting, pangolins can fight back. And there's an account by Booth from 1960. He'd been traversing parts of Western Central Africa, and they came across a giant pangolin with just the head of a leopard in its tail curl. And the account suggests that this pangolin had encountered a leopard, and the leopard had tried to kill and eat the giant pangolin, but the giant pangolin had fought back and had actually wrapped its tail around the head of the leopard and the neck of the leopard and had killed the leopard. And that doesn't surprise me. I was asked the other day, what's the most surprising thing about pangolins? And it was how strong they are. They are phenomenally strong animals. In terms of their reproduction, I thought I'd put this up there because it's a mammal group, and you might be interested in this because it's sort of perhaps atypical among mammals. So females in some of the species, including the white-bellied and the black-bellied, actually conceive the next young while they're actually nursing young. So it appears that they breed continuously, which poses some interesting questions when it comes to things like energy use. But there's evidence to indicate that white-bellied pangolins, for instance, will give birth, and then within 9 days, they've gone out and they've got pregnant again. And so by the time the young are weaned at sort of 5 to 6 months, then another one is about to be born, which I think is pretty interesting. So gestation is around 150 days, and typically just one young is born at a time, although twins do occur, but rarely. Okay, so moving on to how pangolins are valued and used and traded by people. Well, it's interesting, I think. They've been studied in lots of different ways through history, including through anthropological study. And some of you might be familiar with Mary Douglas's work from the 1950s. She was looking at a fertility cult in part of DRC. And this cult was where these pangolin men were created, and they had to be initiated into this group of pangolin men by killing and feasting on typically a white-bellied pangolin. And that invested them with power over hunting, number one, and then number two, over fertility in women. And there was a supposed special link between pangolins and humans, mainly because both just give birth to one young at once, typically. But pangolin skins, there's been lots of trade in pangolin skins through time, as I'll go on to tell you about. But the skins were traded relatively, well, they were relatively common in European curiosity circles going back to the 17th century. And they were sort of traded as scaly lizard skins because we were still in the time of placing pangolins accurately in taxonomic terms. But pangolins have also been characterized as devils, based on their physical form and what have been described in the literature as horrible scales. And in fact, Manis, one of the genus names for pangolins, actually comes from the Latin manes for spirit of the dead in Roman religion. And that references their nocturnal behavior and their unusual appearance. And you see this in other places. In the Philippines, for instance, every now and again you see a news report where a pangolin has broken into a house. And there's this mythical creature in the Philippines called the aswang, and people sort of make this affiliation between this shape-shifting aswang creature and pangolins, because pangolins are crawling around at night and sort of digging things up. So it's really interesting how pangolins have been captured through history. But moving on to sort of more consumptive uses in the present day, as well as historically, I guess. I mean, pangolins have been used for thousands of years by people in many different ways. Virtually everywhere that they've occurred, they've been consumed as a source of protein. And you can see a black-bellied pangolin being put on the fire there in the bottom photo. But their scales have an endless list of applications. Everything from burning the scales so that the smoke improves the health of cattle in parts of Botswana, to the use of the claws or the eyes to keep away evil spirits or to protect people from witchcraft, and these ideas that the flesh confers divination in countries such as Nigeria. And it's the same in Asia, somewhat ironic because the scales are there to protect the pangolin, but people have been taking the scales and they're using it to protect themselves and their crops. So in Indonesia, people will take pangolin scales and attach them to fence posts in the hope that they will deter pests such as deer from coming and getting their crops. In parts of Malaysia, if you possess pangolin scales, that's believed to scare away ghosts. And there's things like Shikar Utsav, a hunting festival in India, where they're hunted, but the scales are also used, as depicted here, to confer health benefits as well. And like other places, they're used by hakims in Pakistan, so traditional medicine practitioners in Pakistan. So international trade in this sort of starts to take us towards what the present day threats are facing pangolin. So there's been a really long commercial trade in pangolin body parts through history. We know from records going back to the 1920s, there were sort of very large volumes of pangolin scales being traded between Indonesia and Hong Kong. We know that there were tens of thousands of skins traded from Southeast Asia to Taiwan between the 1950s and 1970s. That was for the Taiwanese leather industry. That fell away. And we also know that important to contemporary trade and trafficking dynamics in Asia, but also globally, China was harvesting and consuming its own pangolin populations from at least the 1960s through the 1980s. Really high levels of exploitation. We're talking something like 160,000 animals every year. And sort of moving more up to speed and more up to date. So these are data from the CITES trade database. CITES, if you're not familiar, is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's the primary multilateral environmental agreement that regulates international trade in around 40,000 species thereabouts, all pangolins included. And pangolins were included in CITES Appendix 2 in 1975. And most of the trade that you see here, these grey bars, that's trade reported to CITES. These were Sunder pangolin skins, around 500,000 depicted there. And they were taken from Southeast Asia to North America, to the US and Mexico for the manufacture and subsequent retail of leather goods. So belts, boots, wallets, that type of thing. And the world's governments got together in 2000 and said, okay, should we put Asian pangolin species into Appendix 1, which would bring about a commercial international trade ban? They didn't, and they decided to put in place zero quotas instead. So zero quotas for wild specimens traded for commercial purposes. It's kind of like a proxy international trade ban. And what we see from the black bars here, this is a classic case of countries trying to regulate trade in a species, but that trade then going underground. So you can see from the black bars, there's a few spots of grey at the bottom, but there's not much trade reported to CITES. But the black bars are just illegal trade taking place. So we know that illegal trade simply continued despite the efforts of the world's governments to better regulate it. This is a slightly more up-to-date chart, but it only runs from 2000 to 2019. Ongoing concern about the exploitation and trafficking of pangolins internationally led to all pangolin species being transferred from Appendix 2 in CITES to Appendix 1 in 2016. But you can see here sort of 2016, 17, 18, and 19, very high levels of trafficking. In 2019, we're looking at around 200,000 pangolins being trafficked internationally. If we assume that that is around 10%, so this is based on seizures, I should say, and if we assume that seizures are about 10% of the overall trade volumes, we're talking about millions of pangolins being trafficked in that year alone. So it's a real problem. And this is what some of the trafficking routes look like. It's not all of them, it's not exhaustive, but you can see in Asia, the blue arrows there. So this is pangolin scales and pangolin bodies being transported from Indonesia to Vietnam and into China. And then I mean, this only started occurring in 2009, 2010, but we saw this advent of intercontinental trafficking of pangolin scales from a whole range of African countries to Southeast and East Asia, everywhere from Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, DRC, as well as a range of others. And organized crime is clearly involved. We can question the merits of putting pangolins into Appendix 1. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think that's an open conversation, but clearly organized crime is involved, and we can see that through the seizures that are taking place. So this is a photo, I think this one is in Nigeria, where there are all these look like 50-kilogram sacks that are just full with scales. So probably tens of thousands of pangolins worth of scales in these bags. They're traded with elephant ivory and with gorilla parts and chimpanzee parts and leopard things. So highly organized crime. And why is all this taking place? Well, contemporary use of pangolins is for a couple of main reasons, a couple of main products in Asian markets. So one is the meat, which is still considered to be something of a delicacy or a luxury or a status good in China and Vietnam. About a decade ago, I was in Vietnam and I was in the right place at the right time in a restaurant, and some people had ordered a pangolin and they brought it into the restaurant and they took some scissors and they killed it in front of the consumers, and that's so the consumers can sort of see that it's a live animal and it's now been killed and they're going to eat this animal that was alive, and that's how they do it. And that, for me, more than anything, sort of made me aware of the challenge that we face in trying to conserve these species, because that was somewhat acceptable at that time. It's only 10 years ago. We've done some research, and other people are doing research as well, to try and understand who these consumers are. Because if we can understand who consumers are, we can then start to think about behavior change initiatives. And research that a DPhil student did here suggested that in Vietnam, it's men sort of around 36 years old that have something of a high income, but also business elites and government officials that are eating these species as well. And in Ho Chi Minh City, it's also people that are more likely to work in industrial sectors as well. And those that are a little bit older, perhaps even on lower incomes, and have an education as well. So again, reinforcing the challenge that we face in trying to change people's attitudes if we're going to make a difference in terms of pangolin conservation. The scales are also used in China and Vietnam. Both the traditional Chinese pharmacopoeia and the traditional Vietnamese pharmacopoeia have historically included pangolin scales in them. There remains a legal market in China for pangolin scales, or chuanchanja. And what's happened is that, I mentioned a few minutes ago about China sort of using its own pangolin populations and consuming them at a really heavy rate between the 1960s and the 1980s. What we've seen is that after that point, there were active calls from agencies in China for pangolin scales from different parts of Asia, and then countries in Southeast Asia were sending their scales up to China. And the global trafficking that we're seeing now is a result of China consuming its own populations. It's still trying to source supply from elsewhere. It's really unclear what the stockpiles are. So the Chinese government sort of says, okay, we've got stockpiles of pangolins, but nobody knows how big they are or how long they will last or anything like that. But we do know that there's around 26 tons a year are released from the stockpiles onto a legal market, and they're sold through designated hospitals. They're sold with, if it's done properly, they're sold with a certification sticker you can see here on the top right. And this is the way that it's gone. They have been included in the traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia in China, and that's for patented medicines to help nursing women to produce milk, to cure skin diseases like psoriasis, and to improve blood circulation as well. And then something that I think is of a concern, because it's not been in the traditional pharmacopoeia historically, is some emerging texts here that talk about managing cancer with traditional Chinese medicine, and that is some of the ingredients listed in there are pangolin scales. I think positively, in the last couple of years, China has sort of announced that it is going to start to phase out pangolin scales and use them less. So that is a positive. We'll have to see what happens, but yeah, let's hope it's positive. It's also worth noting as well that the literature is mixed on whether scales actually have the desired impact or not. There's no Western science that says consuming pangolin scales, for instance, helps lactating women to secrete milk. Some of the Chinese literature suggests differently. So contemporary use in Western Central Africa, what does that look like? Well, pangolins continue to be eaten as a protein source in Western Central Africa. That's all the species, and they're typically eaten at the forest gate or within villages next to forests. People come out of the forest having been hunting, and then they consume them or they sell them, and they might sell them to urban centers where they're consumed again as something of a status or luxury good. And research that was published here in 2022, a really high proportion of people that were consuming pangolins are doing so because it tastes really good. That's the idea. So, I mean, I think that's legitimate. I have no reason to dispute it, but it's something that we need to consider if we're going to conserve these species and do that in a genuine way. The scales are also widely used, as we've sort of described earlier, but not everywhere. It does change. Some places the scales from the pangolins are discarded. Other places they're bagged and centralized and sent along supply chains, ultimately ending up in East or Southeast Asia. So what do we know about pangolin status? Well, all species are threatened on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. This table here shows the 2013 assessment results and then the 2019 assessment results. So the Chinese and the Sunda and the Philippine pangolins are classified as critically endangered. The Indian, the white-bellied and the giant as endangered, and the Temminck's and the black-bellied pangolins as vulnerable. So we're making inferences there that all populations have declined, are declining, or will decline in the future based on levels of exploitation, based also on habitat loss, high levels of forest loss in Central Africa, even higher levels of forest loss in West Africa, and then a range of anthropogenic activities as well. So things like roadkill, or if you're in Namibia or in South Africa, it's things like electric fences that are put up around game farms. Pangolins come along, they try to get through the electric fence, they can't, they wrap themselves around the wire and they die. So there's some good news and some bad news. Yeah, right. Some of the bad news is that exploitation is increasing and we think is unsustainable. So this is work from Dan Ingram here suggesting that between 0.4 and 2.7 million pangolins are harvested annually in Central Africa for consumptive use in the region, and that has increased before and to after 2000. The percentage of pangolins in the hunter's catch has increased significantly as well in recent decades. And sort of when we're making inferences about sustainability, it's useful here to acknowledge that some of the pangolins that are caught are either sub-adult or juvenile. So it's not just the adults that are being taken, it's the juveniles as well. There is good news for pangolins. Despite everything that I've told you, there is cause for optimism. We're starting to generate data on populations now. We need much more of it, but we're starting. So Singapore is perhaps an easy one for several reasons, but we estimate in Singapore there's around 1,000 Sunda pangolins there. It's quite a wide range, but we do have an estimate for South Africa there between 7,000 and 32,000 Temminckii. And then even more uncertain, it's a meta-population estimate of around 15,000 Chinese pangolins in Taiwan. The other thing that's working in pangolins' favor is that pangolin conservation has really changed in the last 10 to 15 years. When I first got involved in pangolin conservation back in 2007, 2008, I could count on one hand the number of people that were actively working in pangolin conservation or researching pangolins in some way. A number of events and different initiatives have led to the profile of pangolins changing remarkably, and they're now sort of established icons of the illegal wildlife trade. Prince William played a role in this by sort of including pangolins in the United for Wildlife initiative, which some of you might have heard of. The COVID pandemic also shone a spotlight on pangolins because it was actually a miscommunication between two individuals at a university in southern China. A press release went out that shouldn't have gone out. And all of a sudden, everybody's Googling what is a pangolin because they might be these species that are transmitting COVID between wildlife populations and humans. But it wasn't pangolins. Even though pangolins, like many other species, carry coronaviruses and lots of other things around, it wasn't pangolins. So pangolin conservation is changing, and we see that reflected in the literature. There's an increasing number of scientific studies on pangolins, and that's shown here on this chart. We're starting to generate momentum in terms of developing monitoring methods to detect and actively monitor pangolin populations over time in different places, accounting for the differences in the species ecology. A number of different action plans have been produced at different scales, sort of globally in the Philippines, in Nepal, in Taiwan, in Kenya. Governments are showing a lot of interest. The government of Vietnam is taking a lot of action to try and conserve pangolins. Chinese government is doing an awful lot too, so that's good. And I just can't keep up with the number of individuals and organizations that are working on pangolins these days. Every day or every week, another person wanting to get into pangolins comes into my remit. A couple of other bits of good news. The more we sort of go out there and champion pangolins and learn about them, we find some bits of good news. So pangolins were rediscovered in this Senegalese national park after not being found there for 23 years. So they've eked out an existence there, which is really positive. In Kenya, we know more about the species than we did a few years ago. We know that the giant pangolin now exists in a bigger range in the country than we knew earlier. So there are some positive signs and causes for optimism. But conservation is challenging. And I'm just going to talk through a series of challenges now before getting on to Operation Pangolin. So whether you're a pangolin or whether you're another species in trade, be that elephants, tigers, rhinos, hornbills, whatever, it's law enforcement. It's the enactment of laws and regulations and the active enforcement of those laws that's been the main intervention to try and control the use and trade in species through history. And CITES has helped with that. But it's really problematic. And we did some work in the last couple of years to try and think through what's working and what's not working. And there are a number of key assumptions that are not met in a range of different places, many different places, which undermines law enforcement as a key intervention here. So there's 185 parties to CITES, which might give people cause for optimism. Most of the world's governments are parties to CITES. That's going to be good. These countries are going to regulate the trade. Well, it's not quite as simple as that. Only around 60% of parties to CITES actually have laws that are adequate to implement the CITES Convention. It means that 40% of parties don't have laws that are adequate to do that. On top of that, you have chronic and pervasive lack of resourcing for law enforcement, especially in the global south. Most agencies that are charged with enforcing these laws have too few staff. They don't have the resources. They might have vehicles, but they don't have fuel. They don't have communications devices. People are paid really poorly. And that means that the probability of apprehension for people that are thinking about going and taking some of the forest is really, really low. And we know from insights from criminology that if there isn't a high probability of apprehension, then you're not going to solve the problem relying on law enforcement. Oftentimes, actors, be that hunters, traders, or law enforcement agents, they're not aware of the regulations that apply, which species are subject to them, which parts of the species, and conditions associated with harvesting species, and so on. Even if people are aware, they might not be considering that the laws that are applicable are actually socially legitimate. There's many laws that have been implemented for wildlife around the world that have been implemented, and they haven't consulted the people that live in the landscapes where these laws are going to be put in place. Cameroon is a really good example. The 1994 wildlife law that was put in place there was heavily influenced by the World Bank, heavily influenced by the US. And there's people on the ground now that in Cameroon that don't respect those laws because they haven't had a say in what those laws are and the conditions that they're subject to. And then this idea that law enforcement will result in compliance also doesn't hold up. A lot of wildlife law enforcement today lacks strategy. A lot of it is just basic disruptive techniques, either opportunistic or stings, or, we'll go to the airport and we'll try and recover something, but it's not strategic. And so we need to get much more strategic if we're going to rely on law enforcement. Where there aren't well-assigned property rights, and you do have species like pangolins out there, and you combine that with the lack of law enforcement, then you end up with something like an open access resource system where people can just go along and take what they want because nobody's enforcing those laws. And feedback effects are also relevant here. And we've seen this with rhinos in the past. We may or may not be seeing it with pangolins now, where you ban the trade goes underground, you can no longer regulate it well, you can't monitor it, you don't know how many animals are being harvested, how many are being traded. It's clandestine, and that presents a really good opportunity for organized crime to come in because it's high profit, but typically low risk. So law enforcement is the first challenge. The second one is sort of pangolin specific, and it's population monitoring. I mentioned that we've got some population estimates now, but we need much more effort on pangolin monitoring and getting an idea of pangolin populations in other places. It's really hard though, because pangolins are really elusive and it's expensive to monitor them. If you put up a camera trap array, you might get your tigers and your jackals and your clouded leopards and other things that come up in camera trap photos, but pangolins typically don't do that. Their ecology is slightly different. And so when it comes to things like camera traps, well, we might be able to detect pangolin, their presence at sites. We might be able to sort of use some camera trap results to inform distribution modeling, but we're not at a point yet where we can estimate, well, the occupancy at sites or to think about densities or anything like that. And so a whole range of methods have been and are being tried now to improve pangolin monitoring methods, everything from the use of detection dogs, so training dogs on pangolin scat and pangolin scent to see if they can detect pangolins, doing non-invasive genetic sampling, eDNA, iDNA, all these novel techniques. And as part of Operation Pangolin, we're also trialing arboreal camera trapping as well, which is hopefully going to provide something useful. So population monitoring is a second challenge. Third challenge is trade monitoring. We don't understand well enough supply chain, so we don't understand well enough what's happening locally, sort of within hunting areas at the forest gate, what's happening nationally, and then how that relates to international trade and trafficking. And we need to understand all that so we can think about what the actual levels of exploitation are, and hopefully we can then start to tie that back to population and what's happening to populations if we can develop the monitoring methods. So that's the third challenge. The fourth one is reducing consumer demand. And again, it's an open conversation, I think, as to whether this is beneficial or not, and the merits between this intervention and other interventions that you could put in place for pangolins. So reducing consumer demand is recognized as a priority within CITES. So pangolins are listed in Appendix 1 on CITES, but there's also a resolution that's been passed within CITES on pangolins that says we, the world's governments, agree to do different things for pangolin conservation, and that includes reducing consumer demand. But it's difficult, it's challenging. Pangolin scales have been used for millennia in China. There are perceived health benefits. It's used in cancer treatments. And I think more than anything, in China, for instance, people that might be in a position to benefit from pangolin scales, their family members, if their family members are telling them to go and use pangolin scales because it's going to help you, that's the nudge that they need to go and do it. And so campaigns such as this from WildAid, are they going to be effective? Well, I think there are some pretty big questions around some of that. Funding is another issue here as part of this. Typically, these demand reduction campaigns are very time limited, and there often aren't the resources to design them well enough and then evaluate them over the time needed to detect meaningful change. So weak impact evaluation, that's part of this. So this is another challenge, reducing consumer demand. And a fifth challenge here is appropriate trade policies. And we've seen this in recent years in CITES. So there are a number of NGOs out there that engage in CITES that are pushing for more and more restrictive policies on use and trade of pangolins at all levels, be that locally, nationally, or internationally. And you might think intuitively, well, this is good, we need to stop the trade. But what we actually need is a sort of multi-level governance arrangement where if we're going to take decisions at the international level and the national level, there has to be buy-in from local people. If you don't get that buy-in from local people, that partnership with local people, then you're setting yourself up to fail. For some of the reasons that I've discussed, if people perceive the laws to be illegitimate, they're not going to comply with them. Okay, so there has to be this multi-level governance arrangement in place. Some of these organizations that are pushing for some of these policies, for example, with CITES, they don't bear much, if any, of the responsibilities for implementing these policies. So they'll go and lobby and say, look, we're a really big conservation organization. We want to do something good for pangolins, put in place a trade ban, or say that we need to control stockpiles, or go and do this and go and do that. But they don't bear any responsibility. So there's a problem here in terms of the power dynamics and the influence that they exert in forums such as CITES. And I think we need to be moving much more towards an explicit sort of multi-level governance system. So challenge number 6, and this is the last one, it's about engaging local people meaningfully in pangolin conservation efforts. This is probably the best thing that we could do if we had to make If we had one intervention that we could implement today, it would be identifying where pangolins are and then investing in the local people so that they can take stewardship of the populations that occur there. Absolutely key to site-based protection. And there's a whole range of different roles that they could play in doing this. That could involve some consumptive use, it could involve some non-consumptive use, but there needs to be a genuine dialogue with people that live in these landscapes. As one example, there's parts of Cameroon where we're doing research now. People are living in absolute poverty, and people will go to the forest and hunt because they're hungry and they need some food. And it's very difficult to say, don't do that. We need to engage them in a dialogue. If you're going to continue to consume species, okay, which species are there more of and you can consume? It might be a few duikers that we say that they can take every month if they don't take pangolins or something like that. We need to have much more honest conversations with people about how they manage their wildlife and how they hunt their wildlife if we're to achieve anything like sustainability. And we need long-term partnerships as well. One of the things that's held back local community interventions in the past is organizations have gone in and they've imposed external ideas about what they think will work. That's not going to fly. It's not going to work. We know that. Pangolins are lucrative, so there might need to be some monetary incentives as well as non-monetary incentives. And this will be very much context specific. We know from major analyses, things like the best assessment on the sustainable use of wild species, that what works best to conserve species where they are used and traded is context-specific interventions. So there isn't a blueprint that you can use in all these different places around the world where pangolins exist. You have to go in, understand the context, invest in the long term, work with local people, have them as partners and see what works best for them and have a genuine partnership there. And it may end up with something like the devolution of tenure or the devolution of property rights to local people. That might be what it takes to get them on board in a genuine way in the long term. Okay, so I've got 2 slides on Operation Pangolin, and then I'm finished. This is a project that we started a couple of years ago. It's a big collaboration between Oxford, Florida International University, University of Southern California, Zoological Society of London, and the Arabada Initiative. And we're working under a few different pillars here to try and achieve different things. The idea is to help pangolin conservation and do good things for pangolins in Central Africa, and maybe to try and learn lessons from this interdisciplinary project and see how that can be used to conserve other species that face similar challenges. So we've got a team of people that are working on trying to improve monitoring of pangolins and the threats that they face. So they're using arboreal camera traps and they're trying to optimize how many arboreal camera traps do we need to use if we want to detect and monitor the white-bellied pangolin and the black-bellied pangolin, for instance, and try and optical and thermal options. There's a conservation criminologist at the University of Maryland that we're working with, and she's working on conservation criminology approaches to try and get participants in the research to do some risk mapping. What does pangolin conservation look like in terms of risk from people that are actually engaged in the activities of poaching and trafficking, and using other methods like crime script analysis to do something similar. And it might be that we can think about those results and then use things like situational crime prevention. So nudges, things in the right direction to stop people from over exploiting pangolin populations. And then excitingly, everybody's doing AI these days, including us apparently. I don't lead on this bit, but my colleague at the University of Southern California does. We're going to integrate all the different bits of research from our different pillars to see if we can get to a place where we can predict what might happen in the future with a view to that being informative for interventions. And hopefully we'll generate some novel insights for pangolin conservation by doing so. And this is the body of research, or the pillar of research that I'm leading here at Oxford. So this is all about social ecological systems. Hopefully you've got an idea from this talk that sort of interacting with wildlife, living in the landscapes with pangolins and other wildlife, these are complex systems, and they're complex human environment systems or social ecological systems. And so what we're trying to do at 2 protected areas in Cameroon is understand these systems and characterize how they function, primarily focusing on the extraction, the use, and the trade of pangolins, and trying to identify this problem collectively. So not just collecting data from indigenous peoples and local communities, but from wild meat traders and from traditional medicine practitioners and from law enforcement agencies and agents as well. So we can define this problem And we're trying to use a novel approach coming from the governance literature called institutional diagnostics. And this is an approach where we try and identify the key features of these complex systems. And if we can identify these key features, we can then think about tweaking and refining and reforming the institutional arrangements to guide the future behavior of actors, including indigenous peoples and local communities. And if we can do that, that will hopefully set us on a path towards a more sustainable future, both for pangolins and for local people. And that means grappling with the nature of the problem, the politics that might be at play, elite capture, power dynamics within villages, that type of thing, what current social practices are regarding the extraction, use and trade of penguins, and who the players are, who's involved in these networks that exist. And hopefully we'll come up with some interventions which are informed and led by local people, and we can leave a sustainable legacy behind us. Let's see. I'm happy to come back and tell you how we get on. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for listening. If you do want to find out more about pangolins, we published this a few years ago as well, so feel free to check that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Are you happy to take a few questions?
Sure.
If
Yeah.
people have questions. The microphone. Would you like me to use the microphones? Or...
If it helps me here, I'm all for it, yeah.
One of the things that I know from South African point of view is I've got friends there who are very closely connected to the pangolin working in South Africa. And one of the big challenges of that in terms of rehabilitating pangolins is actually getting agreement from
I can hear you now.
From a number of the actual conservation areas, private reserves, things like that, for them to actually go and rehabilitate pangolins on their land. And it's often been, that's been one of the biggest issues that they've actually been having in South Africa, is some of these things you would have thought that these private reserves would allow them to go and do it, but there's a lot of egos involved in these areas. Have you found the same sort of thing in sort of West Africa and Asia as well, in terms of trying, in terms of from a conservation point of view?
Not so much in Western Central Africa or in Asia, no. In Western Central Africa, it's typically the scales that are seized, and so you can't release those back to the wild. In Asia, it tends to be different. So in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, you're looking at seizures of sort of 1, 2 animals, maybe a few more, but sort of maximum. In Asia, where the live trade takes place, sometimes it's hundreds of pangolins, and rescue centers are overwhelmed because they have a limited capacity to house pangolins, and then you have hundreds to deal with, and it's a triage operation. Some will die, some will get looked after, some get released back into the wild. But the problem is different there, because they do identify places where they can release them, but we don't know where the individuals have come from. So there's a high chance that in Vietnam, for instance, where this has happened a lot, there's a lot of Indonesian and Malaysian pangolins wandering around right now because they've been released. So the challenges are different in different parts of the world, yeah.
It was interesting.
Sorry, Jonathan was going to go.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned on your talk about pangolin harvest. I was wondering if that is in reference to like a range of practices, or are all pangolins hunted, or some maybe like locally farmed in a way? I'm not really into this topic of knowledge, but maybe it's been an odd and ignorant question, but I'm wondering, like, how do people, especially because you mentioned very elusive, how do they get these large numbers of pangolins that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, pangolins have been exploited for consumptive use wherever they've occurred historically, right? Pakistan, China, everywhere in Asia, and virtually everywhere in Africa as well. The harvest and the use differs, right? If you're living next to a forest in West or Central Africa, there's some chance that if it's not you, it's one of your neighbors will be going into the forest to get pangolins. Sometimes they use traps. Sometimes it's just opportunistic. Sometimes they go spotlighting at night to see if they can find them. And it's it's to eat the animals, to use their scales, or it's to sell them either locally or along supply chains that end up being international. Yeah, so they've been used through history. Yeah.
I was interested to hear there are pangolin dogs, because pangolins have a very strong scent. And this could be used both by people who want to preserve pangolins as well as people who want to make money out of them. So they train a dog to follow them. The scent is very strong, rather like well-matured chicken shit. And I was very struck by how dogs can very easily be trained to seek them out, because otherwise they're extremely difficult to come by. The other thing, observation, is that there's a very influential clan in Buganda, which is called the Olugove, which means the giant pangolin. And that is the symbol of the clan. And the clan, when I was in Uganda, was actually very active in publicizing anybody who was killing pangolins or trying to trade in them.
It's interesting to hear about the clan in Uganda. Yeah, I'd like to follow up with you on that. In relation to the dogs, yeah, I think it's a novel technology. Let's hope that if it is going to be successful, it is used at scale. Maybe I'm a bit cynical. Every now and again, there's a new technology that comes along that's going to change the world for pangolins, and I wonder if that's going to be the case for dogs or not, because a few years ago, it was something that was put out there as being like, right, this is the next best thing. But it hasn't really been used at scale yet, and that might just be because of funding issues. But it does have a lot of potential. You know, there are places in Vietnam and Nepal where dogs have been tested, and they've managed to find pangolins in the landscape when all the other methods haven't. I mean, these dogs are really capable. There's a guy at the University of Washington in the United States who's pioneered some of the methods here, and his dogs can go on boats and detect killer whale scalp out in the ocean. So incredibly powerful detection capabilities. It doesn't surprise me that they can find pangolins too. It's kind of a balance, though. Dogs are coming on the side of conservationists. They're already being used on the side of those that are hunting pangolins, because some people do go hunting with dogs, and they go hunting for pangolins with dogs. So, yeah.
Briefly, you mentioned uses and species in 2023 and 2024, the mysterious pangolin and the Indonesian pangolin were discovered. Do you know what sorts of progress is being made on communication of those species and different conservation methods being placed to protect them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are two papers that have been published in the last couple of years. One proposing a new species, Manis mysteria, and one proposing a new species, Manis indo-burmanica. I get that right. And the latter sort of supposedly branches off the Chinese pangolin around 3.4 million years ago. Some of the methods that are used, I have some questions about. I don't dispute the genetic work that's done, but some of the morphology assessment that's gone into some of these new species, I question a bit. I think we need some more compelling evidence to start with. We need to use the full range of methods that are open to us for describing new species and to do something. You know, certainly some follow-up work to consolidate what's been done before. If these are indeed new species, are they new evolutionary significant units? If they are, what does that mean for the conservation of the species? Well, it depends where they exist. It may mean something, it may not mean something. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. I'm not a huge fan of splitting species unnecessarily. I don't think it helps conservation, especially given the funding constraints that species conservation is under, especially given the current sort of funding and economic and political climate.
Question would be with the medical use in China, have people analysed the scales to see if there are any pharmacologically active chemicals in the scales? Or is it just tradition?
Yeah, so they haven't done that to my knowledge. I mean, I have looked at this, and as I said earlier, there's no Western study that says pangolin scales, components of pangolin scales have a medical effect. The studies in China that I found are typically, there's lots of them, but they're strangely, they're limited to like one-page studies. And there's so very little detail to them. It's really difficult to understand what they've actually done. But when it comes to the ability of pangolin scales to supposedly help lactating women secrete milk, then they've looked at the growth in mice by giving them milk by giving the mice pangolin scales. And then they've made inferences that, well, the mice that had milk with some pangolin scale ingredient in have grown faster than the control group. And therefore that's great. But they publish it in a one-page study and then they say it works, and it's very difficult to understand what they've actually done. So
it could be protein or something in the.
well, exactly, yeah. So there's lots of reasons why. Yeah, I mean,
You would think proper scientific evidence might help drive the case.
yeah, I think even if there was a scientific study that said that there isn't medical efficacy to pangolin scales, it's going to be sort of politics and other levers that will ultimately result in sort of the policy change that people might want rather than scientific study. I say that because for rhinos, there's been similar things. There have been studies that have debunked whether there's any medical efficacy behind rhinos, but people continue to want rhino horn. Yeah.
How are the scales fixed to the body? Do they come off easily?
Yes and no. Depends how long you leave them in boiling water. Let me show you. You see, essentially they're like fingernails. They have, you can see on the top right here. If you take a scale off, it will look a bit like your fingernail. If you took your fingernail off, there's a scale bed where the scale sits. And the way that people take the scales off, if you're eating them in parts of West or Central Africa, they will burn the scales off. If you dunk a pangolin that's dead in a bucket of boiling water and leave it for 60 seconds, then the scales come off quite easily. I know because I've done it for research purposes. Yeah.
So you showed some pictures of a lion with a pangolin in its mouth and a tiger. I mean, how effective are the scales for protecting the pangolin from natural enemies?
That's a really good question. We don't have data on how frequently predator attacks result in the death of the pangolin versus not, right? I think it will depend upon the age of the lion, how much energy the lion or the tiger has, how old the pangolin is, how thick the scales are. So I think it will vary a lot. I mean, clearly, pangolins are part of the diet of a whole range of different species, everything from different types of eagles, lions, tigers, hyenas, even clouded leopards. And we know because we're finding pangolin scales in the scat of these species, right? Yeah, so it varies is my answer. Clearly a research frontier.
I was wondering if you need more grassroots involvement and local governments. How do you manage, for any research into wildlife trade, how do they manage the corruption on those levels within those countries? There's a lot of widespread corruption. And so how do you get some programming in place easily with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a challenge. Certainly in different parts of the world, corruption is more or less of an issue. There have been instances in the last few years where some of the CITES officials in some Western Central African countries have been found guilty of corruption. So it is a challenge. I'm not sure there's a silver bullet to solving corruption in some countries where pangolins exist. I think at the local level, one of the best things you could do is build long-term partnerships where you approach local communities and indigenous peoples and cooperatives that represent these groups in honest ways, and try and build partnerships where the support for these people, you respect their rights, you respect their livelihood aspirations. You're not going in, you're not trying to tell them what to do or how to do it, but you're trying to engage them as partners in conservation. That's the best way I think it could be done. I mean, if you can achieve success on the ground and you can secure or improve the security of these landscapes where pangolins exist by building those partnerships, then you can go a long way to doing this. And property rights come in here. Property rights are going to be really important. If property rights are clear and are assigned well and can be enforced, then you can achieve an awful lot. There's really good examples where species in use and trade have been conserved because the organizations involved and the researchers involved and the academics and the practitioners involved have got organized, and they've done it in the right way. The conservation of the vicuña, a small camelid in South America, is a really good example of this, where they've got that multi-level governance arrangement, right? Where they've thought about all the issues that we might need to think about for pangolins at any given site. They've thought about that. Where does the species live? How often does it breed? So understanding the species ecology, but then thinking about the benefits to local people. Do they have land tenure? Do they have access to resources? When? Under what conditions? Thinking about the role of technology, thinking about national laws that apply, any subnational laws, what's going to happen internationally within CITES. They've really done their homework and they've worked together really effectively over several decades. And the vicuña is a sort of classic sort of CITES success story because of that.
Well, it's all great to talk, so I think on that note, we better say thank you very much to Dan and wind up our evening. But thank you very much for coming.